So thank you all for coming. Thank you to my friends and family for coming, and thank you to Laura and Jeremy Laura for telling Jeremy, who then made this happen. I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes and show you some fun pictures, and then I'm happy to answer any questions. And what I realized, and especially because we're talking about a genealogical society, I was realizing that there really are four ways I've gotten to know my family's past. One is growing up with a lot of family. The other was our discovery of the diary. Then the internet, which, we all think of as like now you can get everything on the internet. Well, part of what we learned on this trip is there's a whole lot you can't get on the internet. And so then the fourth part is our trip to Latvia. So this is going to be the story of David Blumenfeld. And David, who as you see here in the 1920s, here you see him in the 1950s, was one of my 8 great-grandparents. And I had now I can say the fortune, it didn't always feel like the fortune, to grow up in the hometown not only of my parents, not only of my grandparents, actually 2 of my great-grandparents were born in St. Paul, Minnesota. I jokingly say we have the most boring Jewish genealogy. 3/4 of my family came from within 100 miles of each other in western Latvia. The other 4th came from the exotic location of Vilnius, which was about 200 miles away. And as we learned, they left a flat, boring, forested place with bad weather, and they en masse moved to a flat, boring, forested place with bad weather. And all 8 of my great-grandparents lived in St. Paul, Minnesota by 1884. And I have several of my cousins here who are related to these people. But we're going to talk today about David Blumenfeld, who is one of my 8 great-grandparents. This is one of these things that in July, when I asked my mother to go through all of her piles to see if she to see if she had anything that I hadn't seen before, she suddenly finds this note written by her grandfather, my great-grandfather, in about the 1940s, where he says he was born in Tukums, Kurland, you see spells with a K, Kurland, Russia, because it was in Russia at the time. On August 4th, 1863, he came to America in 1884 to Ludington, Michigan, and he met his wife, who he refers to as Leah Riva, although she was always known as Lena. One of the confusing things is that his mother and his wife had the same first name, Leah, but his wife was referred to as Lena. So if you can imagine, I've witnessed lately these endless email discussions between 2 of my cousins, which is Gittel Zalk of Duluth Leah's half-sister or Lena's half-sister? And they're having all these discussions because she was referred to as Leah's half-sister, but we're not sure which Leah it is. So a little snail. But this is David Blumenfeld, and this is just to let you know where I fit in. There I am down there. This is my mother. This is my mother's father. My grandfather's father, David. This is our author, married to Lena, otherwise known as Leah. And then we have his parents, Ben Zion, otherwise known as Benjamin. Another genealogical challenge. Is it Ben Zion or is it Benjamin? And then his wife, Leah Gottschalk, who we turn out to actually now know is Klatzoff, became Gottschalk, which is one of the reasons we had so much problems researching her. And then their respective parents, Yosef or Yosel, and Yaakov or Yankel, and his wife Hannah. And the story I'm going to tell is the story that David tells of his parents, Leah and Ben Zion, and his grandparents, Yosel and Yaakov. So that's where we fit into this family. Now, I love this picture because this is the family I grew up in. this was taken actually the year before I was born. So I'm not in the picture, but my sister is. Those of you who know my sister will appreciate that. My brother and my mother and father. This is Lorraine. Lorraine's father is Al. Al had 3 siblings. One is Moses, who when he became a prominent judge became known as Joe, because it didn't sell well to be known as Moses in Hartford, Connecticut. Then there is Belle, the favorite daughter, and then there's the missing daughter, Helen. And we'll see how Helen is. When I grew up, all I knew about Helen is she married an atheist communist and they ran away to a free love camp. I thought, wow. I wish that had been my grandmother, you know. But not only was she not my grandmother, she stopped coming to family events. So, and then this is our patriarch, David. This is taken in, I think, 1951, when my Uncle Milton was also never in any photograph because he's the family photographer. So he's never in any photograph. But there's his lovely wife. And this, by the way, is my father's father. This is my other great-grandparent. This is Mary Mark, wow, who is also the great-grandparent of my cousin Avis, and she was born in St. Paul, Minnesota, either St. Paul, Minnesota, or New York. They emigrated from Lithuania. Her parents did in 1868, and arrived in St. Paul in 1872. And from the records, you'd think that she actually gave birth on the train between New York and St. Paul, because some records say her being born in New York, some say St. Paul. But and Lisa, you'll just love this picture. This is my mother, my grandfather, and my great-grandfather, David, the star of our show today. So my mother's family grew up in a little town of South St. Paul, which is, I sometimes refer to it as the Hayward of the Twin Cities. It was a working class. It actually was where the meat packing plants were of South St. Paul. And one of the things to know, why did they end up in South St. Paul? There were no other Jewish-owned men's clothing stores there, and therefore they felt comfortable moving there, because one of the rules within the Jewish community is you didn't compete against a fellow Jew. So, and when they arrived, it was a rather poor place. This is the big buildings of South St. Paul, and it's about it now is a 15-minute drive from St. Paul. By then, in those days, it was about a half an hour drive, and this is where he set up his little store. And what was important about what I knew about my family, they were very tied into the Jewish community. One of my great-great-grandfathers founded the first Orthodox synagogues. When his wife survived him, she helped set up one of the first conservative synagogues. Ben Zion Blumenfeld, David's father, was the first person to be buried in the Temple of Aaron cemetery. They have a long history there. And we always thought of ourselves not as immigrants, but we were Americans. I never heard Yiddish growing up. My family had been in Minnesota, as I said, since the 1860s. So who is David? And this is his wife, Lena, not to be messed with. And they had 4 children. One of them was Belle, who was the intellectual of the family. And then this is my grandfather. So I show this picture especially. This is World War I. He actually never served. The war ended while he was on a train to New York. But, you know, at a time when many Jews were still in the shtetls, my grandfather was a good American in World War I. This is Helen, the one who married the atheist communist. This is our favorite picture of Helen in her Isadora Duncan phase. And Helen, and this is key to the story, Helen, who hated her parents, were angry at them all the time, married the atheist communist. Even though she lived in Minneapolis for the first 20 years of my mother's life, they only saw each other 2 or 3 times because Helen wanted nothing to do with Judaism, And all the family gatherings were around Seders and Rosh Hashanahs and Bar Mitzvahs, so she didn't show up. And it's her daughter who then became Episcopalian. So one of the side stories here is, in all the attention about Jewish conversion, to sort of watch this multi-generational departure from Judaism. And do you convert to get away from your mother, or do you convert, what are all the different reasons? But she did actually have a rapprochement with her father. This is a picture of them in the 50s in Los Angeles. So they did patch things up. But this is, again, David with his two favorite children, Moses, who went on to become Joe and then became a judge in Connecticut, and then Belle there. But David was the ultimate American success, and this is part of what he was proud of. This is David, and probably we think about 1910 at some civic event where he's part of the South St. Paul community. He was on the school board. He was a Mason. And this is the only picture photo I've been able to find of the family store, although the interior really says it all. This is the proud businessman. What do we date this? 1950? Who's the fashion expert here? 40s, that hairdo? The fabric. What the purses, what they were selling here?
The cash register.
The cash register, they never bought a new one. They had that one from, I think, 1902. And then back here was David's little study where he did all of his writing. So, and this is David and his wife in the early 50s. And this is a picture of him when he died. Now, so this is what I knew about my family. I knew they were from Latvia. I knew they were from Lithuania. I knew they had come early. I knew they came to Minnesota. And that's really all I knew. And then and we knew that David was a writer. So let me just talk about David being a writer. David was apprenticed as a tailor at age 10. He never had any formal education. He came to America when he was 20. And by the time he was 40, he was writing novels, he was writing books. He translated the entire Old Testament into rhymed verse in English. 500 pages. I don't know if anyone has read it. When we were growing up, we had boxes of these books. This was in a day before there was Amazon or self-publishing. These were all published by Comet Press in New York, which I later came to learn was a vanity press. In fact, one of the sweet things we found in this box were the rejection letters from Doubleday, from Norton. He got rejected by some of the best publishers of New York, but he had made enough money and had enough sense of self that he published them. And we have his novel, which was about a Jewish merchant who tries to get rich by selling arms to Germans in World War I, only to end up in prison and losing his family in his greed for power. And then we have the Bible verses, which he published in 1927. There never was a book 2 or 3. And then we have what I call the Story of Israel. Now, for those who are serious sort of Jewish scholars, he was a classic maskil. Has anybody heard the name maskil? No. We thought that. My sister wanted to call the book the Midwestern Maskil, and I said, no one's going to know what maskil is. A maskil is a enlightened Jew who follows his Judaism through his studies, not of the Bible, not a Talmudic scholar, not a rabbi, but who studies Jewish history, Jewish culture, Jewish society. And these are people who are not rabbis, not professors, but often business people who are self-taught scholars. And it was an approach to Judaism that took hold in the 19th century. And if you think about now, we have book clubs, we have the Jewish Film Festival, we have the Bureau of Jewish Education. We have actually a long tradition of secular, independent Jewish scholarship. So he was our classic Midwestern maskil. He also was, while he was a member of a conservative synagogue, he preferred to spend his mornings reading and writing. He actually very rarely went to synagogue. He went on holidays, but he was very Jewish identified and Israel identified, but he was not Orthodox and he was not highly observant. So it's interesting in terms of the choices of Jewishness that he had available to him. So we knew he was a writer, but we didn't know much else. And as I said, Helen, the atheist communist, her family had kind of disappeared. But my mother, who is always knitting everyone together, had stayed in touch with her cousin, the Episcopalian, who was a poet, a well-respected poet in Seattle. And by coincidence, I had gone to Seattle because my partner's brother lives there, and had sat down with this family, and my friend Lisa knows them as well. Beth, the poet, who's now 91, and
Just going to turn 90.
now she's going to turn 90, that's right. And her two children, Sean and Julian, and I had spent the afternoon with them in Seattle now 3 years ago, and 4 years ago, and I had not seen them in maybe 15 years. I'd seen them maybe twice in my life. And by total coincidence, a month later, Sean moved. And what do you do when you move? You clean your basement. And there in the basement, in a room that he thought contained only his father's writings, because his father was also a writer and poet, was a box. And here's what he found in the box. There were about 15 such volumes. And it turns out they were books written by David Blumenfeld. And they, of course now they've all been PDF'd and printed, and I'm going to read from parts of it. But it turns out, let me back up and say, I had a childhood memory of there being a box of lost manuscripts. I have this childhood memory of going through my grandmother's attic because someone had said, oh, there was a box of missing books. But I'd sort of forgotten about it, and there they were. And it turns out that when my great-grandfather died in 1955, his favorite daughter, Belle, took them and said, well, Beth, they didn't know, by the way, they didn't know she was Episcopalian. That was actually a family secret that only was revealed by this diary. She had never told anyone that she had converted. But Beth the poet, she's a writer. Let's send the box to Beth because she's a writer. Well, it turns out she opened them and she found a lot of things that weren't very flattering about her mother in them. And she found 8 novels that weren't very good. So she closed the box and fortunately did not throw it away. And then about 20 years later, she gave them to her son, who didn't even open them, didn't know what they were. And fortunately, these are a family of people who saved the written word, which is good. And it went into his basement where it sat for another 25 years. And there it was. And the 8 novels are, there's this term, what he calls, my cousin calls them penny spoilers. Or they're like these penny what are they called? Penny dreadfuls. I'm sorry. These are Jewish penny dreadfuls, and they're quite amazing. My favorite one is the one about the Jewish woman who has a baby out of wedlock, gives her kid up for adoption. He becomes Catholic. He joins the priesthood. She then marries a millionaire, and when she later is having dinner at the American ambassador's house in Rome, she meets the assistant to the Pope, who turns out to be her long-lost son. It's creative. It's creative. Anyways, but the best of these books is what is called diary. And what diary is a 300-page history of the family with only a few names changed. And it is, imagine being able to wake up your great-grandfather and say, so why did you leave? The question we've always wanted to ask. So I now have been able to do that through this diary. A couple things about the diary, just for you to know. The first 2/3 of it use pseudonyms and is very colorfully written. The last third is very bare bones and uses real names. Well, my mother remembers that in the 1940s, her grandfather was going to learn how to type. But he decided he was too old at age 80 to learn how to type, so he hired a typist. And what we think happened is he handed her the unfinished version, and she just typed what she had. So in fact, there's places where the same story is told twice, once with the pseudonyms in a colorful way, once in the more routine way. So we think he just never finished it. The other is, about a fourth of the book is historical sidebars. And I call them sidebars, but they're like 5 or 6 pages. So when he's talking about the problems of the draft, we get a 5-page treatise on the Russian military. When he talks about why they had to move from Crimea back to Latvia, he talks about the Ignatiev laws, the May laws of 1882. And so he's trying to weave together personal history and public history, which is very interesting because what he's trying to do for his reader, he even has a whole 5-page discussion on the Seder. He also, when he meets his son-in-law, who's actually Abe Kalmanson, who Eleanor will know, who was an ardent Zionist, there's suddenly a 10-page justification of Zionism in the middle of the novel. So it's fascinating in terms of history. So one of the first things he said in his introduction, which I love, is his explanation of why his father, who was the first to come, was a failure. And if you read this, while fortune smiled on many of these immigrants and they soon acquired wealth and even positions which enabled them to write their lives with golden letters on the pages of New World history, still the successful ones were only a small minority. The majority, like Benze, that's his father, failed in their efforts. Why? Mostly due to their tenacious loyalty to their faith and their conscientiousness in their religious activities. This became a stumbling block to their material success.
Wow.
And what were the 2 things, you want to guess? What were the 2 things that he's referring to?
Not working on Saturday.
That's one. Not be willing to move to a town that doesn't have kosher meat.
Oh my.
If you wanted to get rich, you had to be willing to move outside of the Jewish enclave. So this is what he says, and this is his little description of Ludington, Michigan here. And so what we learned from this story that we really never knew was that Ben Zion, my great-great-grandfather, he left in 1883 alone, ended up in Ludington, Michigan, and within a year made enough money to send for his wife and 5 kids. So again, this is one of these examples where when he moved, he was worried unless he yielded and broke the commandment, he could find no work in any desirable shop. Part of what's interesting about this is if you compare Midwestern Jewish history to New York Jewish history, I don't think this would have been as big of a problem in New York as it was in the Midwest. So what we learned, they moved. I had never known why my grandfather was born in Chicago, but in fact it's because they went to Chicago for a year hoping to make money. And what we learned, though, was that the family actually was in Latvia in the 1840s, 50s, 60s. Some of them came from Königsberg. We're not sure where the others came from. Then in the 1860s, they moved south, first to the Ukraine, where they had a flour mill that failed. They then moved to the Crimea to try to make money. And then in 1882, when the Tsar was killed and the accusations that Jews had killed him became rampant, Jews were required to move back to their hometowns. Jews were no longer allowed to live, to advance themselves by moving. So he then moved back to Latvia, and that's from where he emigrated. But, so before I show you some pictures, let me just read you a couple of key points from the diary. He's now describing his mother holding him when he was 1 year old. So this is, a little bit of fiction here. One bright spring morning, when the sun was benevolently smiling on all nature, Leah was sitting on the veranda of her 2-story dwelling overlooking the great marketplace. Remember that point. In her native town of Tukums, Kurland. Leah, with her shawl tightly drawn over her smooth shoulders, her lips humming its love song, sat holding her infant child. The marketplace was smoothly paved with gray cobblestones, kept scrupulously clean. What stories these worn stones could tell. And he goes on to talk about how in the city market the peasants would come in, and then there was a fire brigade one day, and then there were military troops. So he's talking all about the life of this town in 1864 when he was born. And he then contrasts his father's impoverished life with his mother's rich family, Janka Hennes. And there's a story here about why Hennes is not her last name. It turns out, I'll just tell you this, we could never understand why he's called Janka Hennes. Well, it turns out Henna is his wife's name. And one of the ways that people were referred to was their first name followed by their spouse's name. It's Yanka, the husband of Henna, as opposed to Yanka, the husband of Rivka, Yanka, the husband of Leah. This is Yanka Hennes. And that was very important because when we were doing our research, we weren't sure what his last name was. But when we found a Yanka Klotzov married to a Hanna Klotzov, we knew we had the right person. Janka Hennes was one of the most prominent and outstanding citizens. He was a good man with sterling qualities. He owned a large number of houses on the Market Row front where he had a large corner store, where he conducted a large business in leather, shoemakers, harness makers, and cobblers' leather findings and supplies. And listen to this, because this will come up in a moment. Peasants frequently visited his shop, for knowledge and his honesty had spread. So those are the kinds of descriptions of what was in the diary. Now, there's a lot about the book about how no good his son is, my grandfather, how no good his daughter is, my great aunt, and part of the story here has been a lot of, I'd say, rather painful discovery of this man who everyone thought loved him, was actually going home every day and writing rather negative things about his family, wondering, you wonder who is he writing for. I don't think he was writing for me, but it's an interesting sort of question of family diaries and who are they for and what's truthful and, what is his story. So armed with this information, we then, of course, went to the internet. And what we learned on the internet, before I get to the internet, I just want to give you a little flashback of how people did research before there was the internet. So this is how my great-grandfather did his research. This is the South St. Paul Public Library. The other document, has anybody seen the 1913 Jewish encyclopedias? There was a 13-volume Jewish encyclopedia. We had inherited 2 sets of them because 2 sets of my family had them. And actually, the description of the Jews of Kurland in that 1913 is fabulous. They describe how many they are, where they worked, where they were from. It's an amazing resource. They had scholars all over the world working on it. So if you're all interested in Jewish history, I think it's now available online probably, but especially the 1913 edition. There were earlier editions, but the 1913 edition is the most complete. And that's where my great-grandfather did a lot of his research, and of course at the South St. Paul Public Library. But in the 1990s, this is one of the letters my mother found, and this is about my father's family, but I want to bring it out because my father, after the Iron Curtain fell, my father started writing to archivists in Riga trying to find records of his father's family. And this, I was very proud because I met with the chief Jewish archivist at the Riga Library, and I could bring her a copy of the letter that her predecessor had written to my father 20 years earlier. And the thing that's very funny about this is that at the end of all this information, she says that if you'd like to get the genealogical table, it will cost you $250, which my father thought was outrageous, so he didn't send the check, and we never got the genealogical table, which, of course, now you can get online, most of which we have done. The only thing I have to say that was really, really funny is at the end of our meeting with the archivist, we said, is there any way we can learn more about our family? She said, well, if you'd like to hire us for $500, we could do the research. And I thought, oh my God, prices have doubled, but otherwise nothing's changed. They were lovely, but it was just very funny because it was the same response. But what we did find on the internet, we have found the birth, death, marriage records going back to about 1850 on the Blumenfeld side. We've gone all the way back to the 1780s on the Znaimer side. We have found a lot of stuff. There's obviously Ancestry.com, Jewish genealogy, Jewish Gen. There's a lot. There are things that you can't find online. And let me just give you an example of that. One of the things we learned in the Riga archives is that they have scanned all of their documents, which are either in German and Hebrew or Russian and Hebrew, depending on when it is. But other than a few of them that have been indexed by members of the Jewish Genealogical Society, they have not been indexed, translated, or digitized. And let me just say that, even when she pointed it out, that was Yossel Blumenfeld's death record, between the almost illegible Russian and the illegible Hebrew, I would not, even if you stuck it in front of me, even though I can read Hebrew, I could not have told you that was his record. So one of the challenges that their records, at least in Latvia, have not all been translated or digitized. Some have. But we did find these wonderful documents, like this is the ship record of going to America via Glasgow on the ship Prague. This left Hamburg on August 24th, 1884. And one of the things we found here, which I love, which is we found the pre-Americanized first names of, there's Leah Blumenfeld, her son David, she was 40, her son was 21. This is Chaim, who became Herman. Simcha, who became, I think, Sarah. Friedel became Francine. Rachel became Ruth, and Margula became Margaret. And we found the ship record also then from Glasgow to New York, also there. What's interesting here is that a sixth kid shows up. We don't know who this kid is. Somebody who tagged along with the family, but one of the mysteries. Oh, also in terms of mistakes, Leah is called Laban, and she's referred to as a man here. So one of the things, just in terms of genealogical research, when an overworked clerk in New York makes a mistake, that mistake sticks around for 150 years. By the way, this is pre-Ellis Island. These people arrived in Castle Garden. So this is Castle Garden, from where you can take the boat to Statue of Liberty. It's still there. That was the pre-Ellis Island. Ellis Island was opened in 1892, I think. Yeah.
Where's Castle Garden?
It's in Battery Park City.
Oh, it is.
It's southern New York. It's where you catch the ferry boat to the Statue of
right
Liberty.
there.
Okay.
A little island.
Okay. So that's what we knew from the internet. So we then decided we needed to go for ourselves. So we, my Episcopalian cousin and my sister and her son and my partner and I planned our trip. And this is a little map for those who don't know where all these places are. This is Latvia. Western Latvia is Courland, this area here. It was its own country in the 1700s. It then became part of Russia. It then became part of Latvia. And one of the things he talks about in the book is how the family went overland to Klaipeda, which is right here, which was then part of East Prussia. It was then called Memel. From there, they took a tramp schooner to Stettin, which is now Sachsen. From there, they went to Hamburg, although we now think they would have arrived in Travemünde or Kiel, and then made their way either through a precursor of the Kiel Canal or overland to Hamburg, from where they got the boat. We now know they didn't go this way. They went this way, and then they made their way to Glasgow and then to New York. So as I say, we stopped in Riga, and Riga was important. And I want to bring this out also because even though my family didn't live in Riga, Riga is where we went to the synagogue, a beautifully restored synagogue, and thinking to myself that but for anti-Semitism, I would have ended up in Riga, and therefore this is the synagogue I might have gone to, and I actually was called for an aliyah and got to have an aliyah in the very synagogue that my family probably would have been at had they not left or been killed. And we also met with various Jewish historians. We met with the head of the Jewish Library. Let me also just give a thank you to Martha Lev Zion, who is the head of the Kurland Special Interest Group. I spent a day with her in Beersheba in Israel, and she was fabulous.
You need to know the date, right?
You found it? Where? Can we please explain? What did you find?
Joseph Blumenfeld.
Wait, how does that know that's Blumenfeld?
That's Russian.
No, that's not Russian.
Yes, it is.
It's Russian.
It's Russian. So where do you see it in Hebrew? Let's see it in Hebrew.
So we in Riga we met with the Jewish History Museum head, who was wonderfully helpful. One of the things he did was he showed us these old postcards. This is Tukums in 1832, and actually this is my great grandfather's store that it was described in the diary. We now know that's the store. We actually think this is the house. We're not sure. And one of the things he did, and this is where we sort of stumbled into a history we didn't realize we were going to, is he pulled out a book of the history of Tukums, and it described how the owner of this store's descendants continued to own it until 1930s, and then they said it was demolished in the 1940s.
To me, this is the first moment when the diary's coming alive, because it was a dead piece of paper until suddenly this man is in the index. The picture is in the book. It's like, it's just amazing.
So could you read that sentence about Yankel?
So here are several paragraphs about the family. Well, about the property, in fact. So initially was built the building facing the market square with a facade. In 1860, this building and one more building near the Vatsmoku street belonged to Jewish merchant Yankel Klatsov. In 1882, it was taken over by David Klatsov. In 1884...
And by then, thanks to that book, I knew the right spelling of his name, and I went back to my hotel in Riga, I'm crying out, and looked at the Yad Vashem website, and was now able to use their Soundex because I knew the right spelling, and I read the testimony of his daughter to learn that my great-great-grandmother's brother, who stayed behind because they were rich and therefore didn't want to move to America, was murdered the first week of the Nazi occupation at age 87 in this town square in 1941. So now could I have learned this before? I'm sure, yes, the information was there. But it was only when I had the names, the place, the objects, the stories, that I looked that up. So it was actually only while we were in Riga, the night before we went to Tukums, that I learned the fate of my family who stayed behind. So that kind of put a real pall over our visit, but it was appropriate. So these are some historic photos of this town. Part of why I want to bring this out is that Western Latvia was not in the Pale of Settlement. It was not shtetls. This was 80% German-speaking until 1918. So even though it was part of Russia, it was considered a separate administrative duchy. There were these group people called Baltic Germans. So the middle class and the upper middle class were all German. These towns were 50% Jewish in the 19th century. The 20% of the country that was Latvian were rural peasants. The urban life was almost totally Jewish and German Christian. We also learned that Jews were not allowed in the town until 1800. Jews could only live in the country, so they came into the town in 1800. And now we have the family store right here. This is in 1928. Apparently it's the 10-year anniversary of the founding of the country of Latvia. That's what this is from. And these are some pictures to give you a sense of the town in the turn of the century. Quite a nice little town. And this is the book that we were shown that was translated to us and shows that it was lived in by, we'll find it here, Klatsov. Where is Klatsov?
Right there.
Janko Klatsov.
Yeah.
Klakovarn. So this is my great-great-great-grandfather, and it shows that he lived in it, and it sort of ends in the 30s and doesn't say what happened to him. And here again are the pictures of the family store. So we then got to Tukums. We actually, one of the things I want to point out, we hired a guide for just one day. A guy who was an expert on Baltic genealogy. He has a PhD in Jewish history. He's Jewish. His family survived the war and he's born there. One of the things.
But in principle, it was very popular business, what I remember from doing genealogy in Lithuania, in Kaunas archives. There is plenty of documents about smugglers. In Grodno archives, smuggling from Poland to Russia. For many Jews do.
So, but we think that it was a little hard to unpack all that. But here we are in historic Tukums. There's my sister, there's my cousin Sean, and there is our guide. We refer to him as Tak Tak because every sentence started with Tak 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 Tak, which it turns out is Russian for yes, yes. He was trying to remember what he was going to say, so we referred to him as Tak Tak, and he was fabulously helpful. He explained everything to us. And here is that main square with those clean cobblestones. And, you try to imagine what was it like in the past. This is it in, what would you say, 1880s? With the horses here. And here is the same view now. Still there. And here's another view of the town. And we can imagine now, there's my wonderful nephew sitting there. Same place, still there. This is the market square, and here's another view of the market square. And
This is the one you found on the internet.
yes, that's one. This is the one I found actually on the internet before we went there. And what's interesting about that is that these buildings are still there. So, and there's the church that you saw on the old postcard. This is what we think is the two-story house with the veranda. It may have been this house. Well, it turns out that the family sold it at some point and the records are not clear. So we don't know which of these two houses it is. This one has an amazing story. Here it is now. The house next to it has been torn down. This house ended up being inherited by a Jewish family who's now fighting over it, post-communism, and so it's sitting empty. So, but there it is, the cobblestones are still there, and there's the house which is sitting empty, and Randolph, being the ever diligent photographer, stuck his camera in, was it a hole in the wall, a window?
Crack.
It was a crack.
Pictures to build this image.
So, and this is owned by another Jewish family that's apparently still fighting over it, and therefore it hasn't been repaired. Now, this is the site of the former family store that what we learned was when the owner was murdered, 5 years later the building was in terrible shape, it was torn down, and 3 of his 5 children died. We have now made contact with the descendants of the 2 children who survived, one who moved to Israel in 1925 and one who moved to U.S. in 1935. And in fact, I just tell you this because in terms of family history, when we learned that one of the families had gone to Israel, my sister said, I think I visited them in the 1960s. And I called my mother, who has a very good memory. She said, no, that never happened. A month later, she remembered that not only had she come to visit them in Israel, they had come to Minnesota, which shows that the families actually had stayed in touch up until the 1960s. And now the connection was lost.
Was one of those descendants the one who had done the testimony?
Yes.
Together?
Yes. And then the other one had come to America, because the testimony in Yad Vashem was done in Hebrew, so I knew it was done from Israel. Yes. So whether there were any claims for this property or not, I don't know, but there is the site of the family store. And now just to go back so you can see it, again, he talks about, one of the things that we found amazing is that everything he said in the diary turned out to be true. He talked about the square being used for new military recruits, and there are the new military recruits. He talked about the peasants coming to his shop because they felt they could get a good deal. Well, there they are, we think 1916, lined up to shop at his store. And so here we have the store still there in time of electricity, and then we went and also through the books, and we did not do the residence check, but through the book we found out that this is where my other great-great-great-grandfather lived. He was a renter. He couldn't afford to be a homeowner. We learned that. This building had a plaque on it saying it was built in 1926, but we don't know whether that's a rebuild, and we haven't found any earlier photos of that. And here we are looking at it. And then we found the synagogue. This is the synagogue as it was. They now have stripped it of its Jewish memorabilia, imagery, and it's now the town gymnasium, including the galleries for the women. Now are the spectator areas of the gymnasium. But to our here's Randolph's effort to bring back the Jewish iconography back onto the synagogue exterior, but as opposed to now. But there is a plaque saying that it was a synagogue there. But what we were pleased to see is that there are 3 placards inside the gymnasium. This is the synagogue. There was a small synagogue across the street. And there we have a history of the Jewish community with details of various Jews of the town. And even, this is it. This, for a town that was almost half Jewish, this is the totality of Holocaust history of that town. It's a placard about 3 by 4 feet in the former synagogue. So, as you see, it's quite an intact town, beautiful wooden architecture, and we then ended our trip to Tukums, as I guess most of these trips end, by a visit to the cemetery. Our guide has actually transcribed all the names, and we weren't sure if there are any names of family members. Part of it is there's no surnames prior to 1826 in this town, so it's really hard to find people. I since, through various articles, have gotten in touch with a guy who in the past was paying somebody to help fix this cemetery, but they haven't done much work in the last couple of years. So this is a sense of the cemetery. And, these are the Jews who stayed. Now let me just quickly show you some images from the last place we went, which was having read in the book that he departed from Memel to Hamburg, Randolph and I decided we were going to follow in his footsteps by also going to Memel, which is southwestern Lithuania, and taking a ferry boat to Hamburg, following the same route he did on almost the same week, 129 years later. And this is what it looked like. And you'll recognize this building in a minute because this is what it looks like now. And this is what the old river, it's a river port going out to the Baltics. So I want to just tell you about what we're planning to do with this story and what we then learned. When we were with the Jewish History Museum director, he took out this book on the history of Tukums, and he said, you really must go meet Agrita Ozola, who is the head of the City Museum, and here is her phone number. Again, we had no idea there was a history museum there. Nothing is in English on any of their websites. We couldn't reach her, and finally, the morning we were there, I called her, and I said, and she spoke very good English, and I had my 1 minute to explain what we were doing in Tukums, and she said, of course, I'd be happy to meet you. And I was able to read to her the description of her town of 1864, the description I just read you, that had been written by my great-grandfather in 1920. And she was the city historian who knew nothing about the Jewish history of her town. Wow. And I was able to come from California to read it to her. It was, that was worth the price of the trip right there. And and there's nothing about the Jewish history in this museum, even though the town was half Jewish. And there's a whole lot of politics about the Jews in Latvia. And one of the things I said to my friend Irene this morning, we kept wanting to talk about the 19th century. Within 10 minutes, you're talking about 1941. Because, where are the Jews now? What happened to the Jews who stayed? Why isn't there any Jewish history? Why is everybody so uncomfortable talking about the Jewish history? It all goes back to that 2 weeks of 1941. And it was interesting because we didn't want to talk about 1941. Although then when we learned that our very cousins had actually been murdered in 1941, suddenly we wanted to talk about 1941 also. So the whole shape of the trip changed. But because we're mostly talking about the 19th century, I think it's easier for people to engage with us. And so we are now looking at doing a museum exhibit in Tukums about the Jews who left and the Jews who stayed. And looking at why did he leave, because one of the things we've learned is what may have been the real reason he left is that his rich father-in-law gave the business to his son and was sick and tired of helping his ne'er-do-well son-in-law, who then was going broke at the very time when the opportunities for Jews were limited. And so if you ask, why did he leave? Again, and this is what takes us back to David Blumenfeld's diary, he's trying to explain family history by looking at social history. Well, in fact, the fact that he had to move back to Latvia because of these 1882 laws, at the very time when his father-in-law is tired of supporting the family, now we know he had, if he didn't, not only was America the continent of glory that he was going to, he had nothing happening at home. And so the decision to leave rather than stay was the intersection of the family history with the social history.
They're economic migrants.
Yes, but the economics, it was not that the Jews of Tukums were poor. It's not even that he was poor. He had had a flour mill, he'd had a tin shop. It was that everything had come to a dead end for him. And he was forced to move back to his father-in-law's town. And in fact, one of the questions that we asked ourselves is, well, where did he get the money to come to America? And my sister said, oh, obviously, his father-in-law was happy to pay him the money, get him out of town with his wife and 5 kids. So what this journey has really taught us is, what are the choices that we each have?
Don't forget the date of the pogrom.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Thank you for reminding me of that. One of the debated stories is, were there pogroms in Courland? And everyone we talked to said there were no pogroms in Courland. And in David's book, he talks about hearing rumors of pogroms happening in Odessa. And there were and by the way, there were Jewish newspapers in German, not in Yiddish, but in German, of Jewish life that he could subscribe to in Latvia in 1883. There was a rumors of a pogrom, though we now have found two references, one in a book written by a woman whose grandfather was from Tukums and another one by somebody whose grandmother was from Tukums, saying that in 1883 a group of drunken guys beat up a bunch of Jews and the police stood by and did nothing. Now these would not be considered pogroms because pogroms are generally seen as state-organized beating up of Jews. So it's interesting then that this doesn't come up in David's book, but his perception, and he talks about it, is that the sense that the opportunities for Jews was closing coincided at a time when his economic fate was being limited, such that moving to America would be an improvement.
Would his children and his sons have been subject to the draft?
Yes, I can tell you about this. So first of all, Ben Zion was drafted in 1863 after he impregnated his wife, but before David was born, because the story is that David didn't see his father for the first year. There was not a 25-year draft. There was a 5-year draft. The 25-year draft ended in the 1850s. It's a myth that was existed after that. But if you were at all middle class, you could buy your way out. And in fact, what the diary talks about is this whole Cantonist system of recruitment, where again, Ben Zion's rich father-in-law bought him out of the army. But what he also explains is that that the girls could get passports to leave in 1884, but the two boys could not because they were subject to the draft. Why David had not yet been drafted at age 20, we don't know. But when they got to the then Prussian border, they had to pay smugglers, the coyotes of East Prussia, to smuggle them across because the boys were escaping the draft and thus could not get passports.
They must have had to smuggle them, on the boat to Hamburg?
No, because Memel, now Klaipeda, was East Prussia. It was Germany. So once they got there, the Germans did not require visas.
It's a land border from Courland to East Prussia.
But the question, one of the things that we don't know is like, how did the money get wired? How did the tickets get wired? Those I have figured. And the other piece to know, just saying, I'll answer your question, is that in present day dollars, the cost of shipping 5 people was $10,000. So what's interesting is that, talk about differential economy, Ben Zion in 1 year in Ludington, Michigan, was able to save $10,000. We have a story in the diary. What happens is, I'll just tell you this, David and his 4 siblings and mother arrive in Castle Garden, and they're not let out of Castle Garden because nobody is there to meet them, and they don't have enough money. And the ship is going back to Hamburg in a week. And the immigration officials allow David, the 20-year-old, out for a week. He then walks up and down Manhattan. This is maybe a little fictionalized, looking for people he recognizes. And of course, somebody from his hometown recognizes him, decides to give him enough money for the train to Michigan. He goes to Grand Central Station where they're only selling first-class tickets that he can't afford. So he then is taken to Newark, where he gets a third-class ticket, takes the train to Michigan. His father is out on a peddling expedition, and so he has to go to Milwaukee and finds his father in the bus station. And his father then gives him enough money that they then go back on the train to New York in time before the family is sent back to Hamburg. So we're, those of us who are from Minnesota, we have these fantasies that the Coen brothers are going to auction this. And, and this is going to be their next movie, and that's going to be actually the best thing. But the diary, and again, everything he has said so far has been true, said that Ben Zion was able to send the money, and they had telegraph then, and also the shipping companies had agents. This is one of the advantages of being in Courland as opposed to a shtetl in Poland, is that this area of Courland, as you see, was a fairly middle-class city and was connected to East Prussia. They had telegraphs. There were agents from the shipping companies. This was a Hapag-Lloyd ship. So it's even possible that Ben Zion went to a Hapag-Lloyd office in Chicago and paid the money that enabled them to pick up their tickets in Hamburg. So we know they didn't otherwise have sponsors.
I was wondering whether Ben Zion had fiscal sponsors.
That's interesting. He mentions that he had a friend in Ludington, Michigan, who had sent him letters about what a wonderful place Ludington, Michigan was. I have a friend here who's from Ludington. Families from Ludington. We went to Lithuania, Latvia. We didn't go to Ludington. One of the things that is, in terms of understanding this Jewish history, for example, my mother's family, my cousin Avis is here, they left Vilnius. My mother's family, this is my mother's father's family. My mother's family left Vilnius in 1868, got to New York in 1868, got to Minnesota in 1872. We can't find, and their name, which was then Mark or maybe Markovsky, a less unique name, we can't find anything about them because just the records in 1860s and 1870s are so thin. The name issue is really interesting. One of my ancestors is named Feinstein. We can't find anything about them. It's too common of a name. The things we know the most about my father's mother's side is named Znaimer. If you want to research Znaimer, it's really easy because if their name is Znaimer, you're related to them. It's such an unusual name. But you start going with Mark or Feinstein, you start having problems with names. And the other thing that's really interesting about the names, again, this was a German-speaking area, and we were one of the things we were trying to do on this trip is to figure out what language did he speak at home. Because what everyone says is that Courland is German, not Yiddish, because it was 80% German. It turns out, according to all the people we met in Latvia, there is a dialect it's sometimes called Juddeutsch, or German Yiddish, which is unlike ordinary Yiddish, which is about 60% German. Juddeutsch, or German Yiddish, is about 90% German. And even though they may have written it using Hebrew letters, it's a very, very close dialect to German, and therefore that's probably what he spoke. And it also would explain, because it's so close to German, if you were hearing your parents or your grandparents speaking it, you would think they were speaking German. So that's the language. And even though Russia took over Courland in 1799, the Russification took many, many years. So one of the things we saw is the 1840s records, even though it had been part of Russia for 40 years, the 1840s records are still in German.
It wasn't about 1860s that they became...
Exactly. Starting the 1867 death record of my great-great-great-grandfather, that was in Russian. So, again, the whole politics and the political history of these places makes doing the genealogy really complicated. Because and the names, so for example, Klatsov became Klatsiu, became Klatsarov, became Gottschalk. Finding, the names themselves becomes very difficult. Yes?
I'm curious where you found these Latvian records, because I went to Moldavia trying to find stuff, and there's
the answer is Rita Bogdanovich. She is the Jewish archivist at the Latvian State Archives, and she was incredibly gracious and spent the entire morning with us, and it was an introduction actually through Martha Lev Zion of the Jewish Genealogy Courland Sig, and she showed us that they are in fact have all been scanned. Now,
Jewish archives?
Yes, these are, what happened is, they are created by Jews to meet the state requirements. So, for example, these death records, they were compelled. There are no Jewish records per se. Synagogues didn't keep birth and death records. Unlike Christians where you have baptism records, the Jewish synagogues did not keep records. I'm not even sure the cemeteries kept records. So the records that exist were actually required by the Russian authorities.
Of the Jewish community.
Of the Jewish community, yes.
Itself,
Yes.
by the administrators of the community.
You have it right. So these records were death records. They were compiled by the officials of the Jewish community for the public record, not for a Jewish record. And they are German and later Russian on one side and Hebrew on the other side. By the way, one of the other things, people often say that Hebrew was only a biblical language in the 19th century and they didn't use it for regular things. These were Hebrew records that described cause of death, names of relatives, all using correct Hebrew for, cancer and nerve illness. So they were using Hebrew for non-biblical purposes.
But wasn't a spoken language? I think that's what the question is.
I don't know. I don't think so. But in fact, what's interesting is that they were able to keep these records in Hebrew. And what's also interesting is that even though they were prepared for the government, they were in Hebrew.
It's also interesting that the Russians didn't destroy them.
Yeah. Well, and these were generally kept in the city, and then sometime in the 60s and 70s they were moved to Riga, we think. In the museum, I didn't show you this, they had a diorama of this main square in 1890, in 1920, in 1950.
Wow.
And suddenly in 1950, there's an empty lot where the store was. So I had this moment, you're thinking about what's the right way to say this. So I said to the head of the museum, I said, do you know why that corner became an empty lot? And she said, I've always surmised, but I didn't know. And then I was able to say, it's because David Klatzoff was murdered in 1941. Anyways, thank you very much.